You know why I love being a Unitarian Universalist? Because every once in a while I can get away with something like playing the Ramones during a Sunday service. It was a Thursday night, maybe a Friday. As I did on so many nights in my early 20s, I was hanging out with friends and listening to music. I was never much of a musician myself. I can strum some chords on the guitar, but I knew I'd never make it big. Nevertheless, music played a large part of my coming of age. See, I didn't have a whole lot to do in those days. I was a high school dropout, working a dead-end job, barely making ends meet. There was no hope for me on the horizon. At least I didn't think so. I hated my life, and those nights became outlets to get my emotions out in a healthy way. Well, at least as healthy as a bunch of young adults without much sense of purpose could muster. This night was special. Someone told us about a party where there'd be live music, and we decided to check it out. I'm pretty sure the headlining band was Coda Armada, a Louisville hardcore band that was making the rounds in the local scene. It wasn't the first scene I'd ever been to, but it was the first that I had ever been to in a house smaller than the Bush Center, in the working-class Germantown neighborhood of Louisville, the top floor of which was converted into the smallest music venue I've yet been to this day. I'd later found out that a couple had rented the house, and then they took what they needed to turn it into a space for community, taking the smallest sleeping area for themselves so that they'd have plenty of space upstairs. In that moment, it felt like the good life, or at least the best I'd ever known. I'd never felt like I belonged anywhere. Not in my family, not at school, not at work. I was finally beginning to accept some parts of myself, but in other ways I was still finding my way, a misfit in the world of misfits. Music became for me an outlet, a way to express how I was feeling. The way it touched me didn't make everything okay, but it did make it easier to navigate for another day. I still remember the faces of the people there that night, many of them in a similar situation as I was, jaded millennials and late Gen Xers, often with different concerns, but nevertheless a feeling of not belonging. In some ways, the bands were just an excuse to get together, to see old friends anew, to feel like we all belonged for just a moment, over music and crappy beer, and boy was it crappy because it was all we could afford, in a building where we were likely breaking multiple fire codes. That night, I think I realized for the first time the true meaning of church. Even though I grew up doing this thing called worship every week of my childhood, I now realize I was just going through the motions. The holiness church I grew up in was yet another place I didn't feel like I belonged. And this was hammered home for me when their theology ended up excluding me. I felt a little community there, but it was very conditional, dependent on me being the sort of person they thought I should be. Now, a disclaimer for any of you who are here for the first time, we don't always play Bikini Kill in our Sunday services. But I've decided to do something a little different because I think punk rock and its subgenres, including hardcore, have gotten a bad rap. They're associated with rebellion for rebellion's sake. Really loud and noisy music without a purpose for kids who just need to straighten up and get a real job. To me, it's so much more than that. I get it if the music itself isn't what you want to relax to before bed. But it's so much more than that. I want to propose this morning that punk rock has a lot to teach us about being human. So this Labor Day, let's all put on our Doc Martens. Eric and I did. Where are yours? To understand the rise of punk, you have to understand both the culture and the music scene going into the 1970s. The rise of the Nixon administration and a seemingly endless war in Vietnam discouraged so many who were once optimistic about the future. As hippies came of age and found themselves confronted with the need to make a living, more and more gave up their optimism and joined the mainstream. Whereas they once preached a gospel that was more akin to socialism, many of them became the greatest ambassadors for the status quo. In the music world, many were jaded by how rock had changed during the 1960s, with the superstardom of bands such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Mainstream rock going into the 1970s seemed edgeless to many, a simple consumeristic vessel without any real purpose. However, this was not universal. By 1969, bands such as the Stooges, the Velvet Underground, and the New York Dolls were playing a different kind of music. Much simpler songs that tended to thumb their noses at the world. And by the mid-1970s, something amazing was happening in New York City, the birth of a new genre. At the CBGB Club in Lower Manhattan, bands and artists like Patti Smith and Television started playing music inspired by the 1960s garage rock scene, as well as the proto-punk of a few years prior. And across town, in Queens, the Ramones were creating their own sound, drawing on the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Herman's Hermits, and the Stooges. By the end of 1974, it's said that the Ramones had in only 1 year played over 74 shows, including some at the CBGB. The next year, young Britons, inspired by what they had seen on vacation at the CBGB, created a scene mimicking the New Yorkers, inspiring such British bands as the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, the Damned, and the Clash. Now, early on, nobody could really tell you what punk meant. Some were saying it meant anything that was outside the mainstream. Some were even calling Bruce Springsteen punk. And he did write a Patti Smith song, so maybe he was more punk than we give him credit for. But it really personified the new genre. People who embraced the aesthetic of the scene were largely outcasts, people for whom society wasn't giving them an outlet. They really were misfits, societal outcasts for whom the system was not working. It was appropriate they embraced the moniker of punk, which, dating back to the days of Shakespeare, has almost always referred to the rejected of society. In the words of Joanna Norledge of the British Library, punks were worthless people, petty criminals, cowards, weaklings, amateurs, apprentices, and inexperienced youths in general. This new genre, full of bands who refused to conform to the standards of music of the day, were punk. And many of them saw that as a moniker to be worn with pride. They were never, most of them, the best musicians around. In fact, if you know anything about playing guitar, you know it's incredibly easy to play the power chords that compose many punk songs. Very few have seen mainstream success, and the ones who did so by radically changing their aesthetic. The Clash, Blondie, Joan Jett, Patti Smith, Henry Rollins, and Iggy Pop, for instance. Some punk musicians were focused on themes such as leftist politics, such as the Dead Kennedys, or darkness, such as the Misfits. But what many of them seemed determined to create was a place for them in a culture that didn't make sense, a place where they belonged. And that's much of what early punk culture was, a haven for people who didn't fit into the dominant culture. Astonishingly, for the 1970s, very few in the genre gave a second thought to queer and transgender people. In fact, Jane Country of Jane Country and the Electric Chairs was the first transgender lead singer of a rock band, and she's still active at age 74 today. The aesthetic was working class enough that no one felt out of place for not having enough money. And much radical organizing throughout the 1970s and 1980s happened in punk spaces, because that's just where you went if you wanted to find acceptance for who you were. Later offshoots of punk, such as queercore and Riot Girl, which we heard in Bikini Kill this morning, would even produce queer and feminist positive music that sought to combat prejudice and bring liberation to queer people and women. For many, the punk scene was just where they found community. One participant in the Ann Arbor, Michigan punk scene remembers how they came together to support the local drag queens after a popular Ann Arbor gay bar started discriminating against them. Whether you were gay or transgender or a drag queen or not, you put on a dress that night and you marched around that bar, because it's just what they did. Others developed lifelong relationships that helped them find some limited sense of liberation, an acceptance they weren't able to find in the rest of the world. Yes, punk was to a degree about rebellion, but it wasn't mindless disobedience, but a path with some hope that the status quo could be shaken up enough to create a new way of being, one with the potential to bring liberation to those who were pushed to the margins of the mainstream, those who just didn't belong. I'm going to go even further this morning and say that punk provides a blueprint for beloved community. I mean, sure, punk had very different music than we do in most Unitarian Universalist congregations. I'm not anticipating that I'm going to get to play a punk song for you again in a service anytime soon. But I wonder, though, if our impulses towards building new ways of being that can bring liberation to others aren't similar. There was room within punk for all kinds of ways, for taking care of each other, both musically and culturally. And for many, the scene became a laboratory to experiment with how the world could be. When the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag and the Sex Pistols were singing about new political paradigms, or queercore band Pansy Division sang about their sexuality, they weren't just doing so to shock. This was the world they wanted, the one that they dreamed of that could be built, the one where they were accepted, where they were allowed to be who they were. Some say punk died, often if you ask it sometime in the 80s or 90s. But I'm not sure that's accurate, as much as it just splintered into separate subgenres, Some trying to maintain the original spirit of punk, others going more mainstream, and unfortunately at least one turning towards white supremacy. By the time I came of age, hardcore and alternative rock were the two that I found myself most immersed in. I won't pretend like I was some super devotee to the scene who was out there every night, but it did help me find myself, especially when I felt I didn't quite fit in anywhere in the Louisville scene. In some ways, being a part of those communities, sharing sharing experiences, good times, and even my first vegan Thanksgiving meal. These were a stepping stone of my calling of spiritual development and building community. I feel passionate today about helping people find their full potential and of building communities where everyone belongs, because I was once shown such hospitality. I'm not sure if the original punks realized this consciously, but they sure did exemplify it in the space they created for people to be their best. For me, Unitarian Universalism can be a similar way of building community and helping people find their best selves. I don't want to pretend like the punk scene isn't without its own problems. It certainly wasn't perfect. But neither is Unitarian Universalism. So as imperfect people, I think there's some lessons we can learn from punk together. First of all, we shouldn't be afraid of experimenting, of trying new things, if it means living out our mission. Just as a couple converted the upstairs of a house to be space for gatherings in Louisville, just as some of the most popular punk musicians were those willing to do things drastically different from the mainstream to create a new way of being, what are the ways that we can find to do things anew? Even as the statistics tell us people are becoming less and less religious in this country, what are the things we can do to revolutionize the act of building community? This may mean new ways of doing services or classes or how we move in the world, and we've certainly had plenty of practice with COVID-19 the last year and a half. It may mean unlearning old habits and becoming truly liberatory communities. But if we're not flexible, we run the risk of becoming silos where new and different people don't feel welcome, which leads to the second lesson. We need broad umbrellas. When we don't allow for broad, diverse conversations, we risk reproducing patterns of domination and supremacy. We are stronger the more diverse we are, so we need a lot of different people to help keep us accountable. Our hospitality must be prepared to welcome in people who challenge us, because by being challenged, we will become better people. And the final lesson, and in my experience, I'm not just talking about here, I'm talking about every Unitarian Universalist community I've ever been a part of. We need to remember we need fun. Some of the work we do can be draining. It can seem like work that never ends, and sometimes it doesn't. We need to remember that self-care is liberatory in itself, that taking care of ourselves is a prerequisite to taking care of others. Not learning this lesson can lead to bitterness and burnout, to not being able to do anything. We need to find some music and dance and party and celebrate the night with like-minded comrades. And maybe I mean that figuratively, but maybe I mean that literally. I know I'm not going to convince you all to become punk rock aficionados. I don't expect to hear lots of reports that you've gone home and listened to playlists. But what I do hope to convey is how much each of us needs a place that accepts us for us and encourages us to grow. One of the places I found that was the Louisville punk scene. And if I had to have a prayer for each of you, it's that you also have such a place that nurtures you to become the best you can. I hope for many of you it's here. And may you not be afraid to get down and dirty in the pursuit of all life has to offer. May it be so. Our closing hymn is number 168 in the Gray Hymnal, One More Step.
Please join me in extinguishing our chalices. You will find the words in the order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please be our guest today after the service for our coffee hour here. This is an opportunity to check in with folks about the service and how their week has gone. If you are not signed up for our email list, please make sure to do so to receive updates about ways to connect. You can find information on signing up at our website, auuf.org/subscribe. Please join us now for our sung benediction.
Go forth into the world in peace, Be of good courage, hold fast that which is good. Go forth into the world in peace, love, people rejoicing in the
Our benediction is by James Morrison. Within each of our hearts, there is a most glorious light. Go forth and let its spark help you understand what troubles both you and others. Go forth and let its light of reason be a guide in your decisions. Go forth and bring its ray of hope to those in need in both body and spirit, that they might find healing. Go forth and fan the flames of passion to help heal our world. Go forth and spread the warm glow of love pushing back the darkness of the world. Go forth and share your glorious light with the world. And now a special postlude to end our special service.